Because of these changing times, either it's cloud or Gen AI, other factors, how are companies like Percona, which can be seen as either a proponent or patrons, of open source, because as we discussed earlier, commercialization is really important for the sustenance of open source. How is your role changing in the ecosystem where you feel that you have to evolve? And I'm talking about as a company with the changing times. So not only, as you said, to stay ahead of, not ahead, but to remain a viable competitor also, it doesn't matter who it is, but at the same time remain a patron to the open source community, so they do know that they have backing of somebody when they are putting their time and effort into maintaining that code base. Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya and welcome to TFR Let's Talk. Today we have with us Anne Schlemmer, CEO of Percona, and it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
First of all, it's my pleasure to host you here today. And second is that this topic is also important. Depending on who we talk to, people may have different opinion. But if you look at the last couple of years, of course, open source has kind of become the chosen or preferred model of software development collaboration, if not the default. But then there has been some cases where we saw even big companies, they change their licenses. Some companies, the way they interact with open source communities, it changed. So some people may say, hey, you know what, open source is going through its midlife crisis. So I want to understand that if it is really midlife crisis, or we are still in a toddler phase where some people are just throwing stuff here and there. So what I want to understand from you, because Percona, is one of the major players in open source, both commercial and community side. How do you look at this? What are you seeing is happening? You are like, hey, this is the natural progression, or you're like, no, there are some disturbing trends.
It is a fascinating conversation, and I'm chuckling as to, what phase are we in, right? I've been with Percona for a while, and I've talked about us being teenagers, right? When we got into our teenage, and um, open source is much older than that, so I don't think we're in the toddler phase any longer. I think that as the environment just continues to evolve and change, I mean, when you see it with the cloud, I think what we are seeing the most of is challenges because of investment and investors and what folks are looking for. So that has changed. That I would say that has a large influence in what's happening on open source. So you're having people who are coming in. Is it a business model or is it a way to develop software? And being very clear and distinct about that. The pressures of investments and having outside investors, I think, is a big push behind a lot of this, quite frankly, because it's getting that shareholder return.
There's a big difference in, if you look at Linus Torvalds, he created Linux kernel to scratch his own itch. All the open source, creator developers, they saw some problem, they wanted to fix it. They never envisioned it to become a big giant. The world literally runs on open source today. Sometimes we see some internal conflict within communities, because this is a community, people have different approaches, different ideologies. But then the problem that you're talking about is totally different from that. It's about, I mean, we can use the word outsiders coming in. They see a value in this, you can say product or company. They invest money there. Talk a bit about how does it change, like investors or investments or VCs. I don't want to like put any label on anybody. How does it change the nature of open source, the way, and why do you think that it harms open source? Does that question make sense? Am I able to cover what you?
So if we think about why open source and is it an ideology versus a business model? Um, and then you get into licensing. But if you get at the heart of, well, I'll talk from Percona's perspective. Why are we open source? Because we believe in that in an open world, and that so everybody can innovate. So feeling comfortable and understanding that, hey, we're putting our software out there so that people can build upon it and they can innovate. They can run their business the way they want to. So what are the criticisms that we hear on users of open source is, hey, they just took my code and they're making more money than I've made on it. Okay, well, what was the purpose of you putting out your open source software to begin with? Those are where those maybe frictions, as you mentioned, you said, like C's, that is it code? Is it community? Is it contribution? Is there conflict? Where's the collaboration coming? So the innovation, if the reason to say, hey, we want to democratize innovation, we want to democratize software development, then you have open source. When you need to be a viable business. It's not free, right? When you talk about free, they're free as in beer, free as in puppies, or what the expenses that we hear on different things. So where does the influence come from different interests if that's on the business side? So an investor, a shareholder, should expect a return on their investment, right? There's conflict that when someone says, hey, I just put out this software, you took the software that I put out, and now you've made yourself a ton of money. What did you contribute back? I'm not sure that's necessarily the right question, but that's questions that are being asked right now. And where are we at in the evolution of open source is everything has to evolve with the times. We need to evolve and understand, are there different licensing models we need? Do we need to go back and own the word better? I feel like open source is similar to labeling that might have on organic foods or natural foods. It's a great selling point. It's a great marketing point. But what does that really mean? And for some folks who aren't understanding the movement, it might just be a feel good versus, no, there's something really serious behind this, and having those frank conversations about it.
Should open source companies or folks who create their open source project be also careful where they're taking investments from? Because this is once again not like when you're, no offenses, but if you are building an organic farm, you might not want to take money from, let's say, fossil fuel companies. This is just hyper, I'm not blaming anybody. So you do want to ensure that the whole chain of your business, not just the code, but where the investment is coming from, aligns with the ideology. So yes, you can develop the code with the ideology, but what about investment? Should there be an approach of alignment with who is investing, what is their philosophy, versus just taking money because somebody is investing $50 million into your project and company?
It starts with your intent and what your mission is, and being a mission driven business or not. And I just mentioned you need to continue to evolve. Open source needs to continue to evolve. I need to continue to evolve as a leader, right? Nobody is static. You won't. It just can't be if you want to thrive and grow. So making that decision to bring in investments, it's you just need to be clear on what is your intent. You hear back in, it was 2008, Harvard Business Review put out The Founder's Dilemma, and they talk about, do you want to be rich or do you want to be king? I might say sovereign instead of king or queen. Which is it? Which do you want to be? And are they mutually exclusive? So if you want to, why are you going into open source? If it's you had a project and it started, as you just said, someone was scratching an itch and it's a hobby, and then wow, you solved this problem, and now you're seeing, oh, this could be a viable business. Okay, so maybe you didn't think about that from the very beginning. So now stop and say, this is what I want to go. If you want to say, this is an awesome thing, I want to spread the world, I'm going to bring in outside investment to grow, you need to understand what are the expectations of your investors versus what are your brand promises maybe that you've already put out there. What are your, the word moral just keeps wanting to come out of my mouth, but what are your values that you are standing for? So some of the discussions, people being upset where they're feeling that there's been a bait and switch from some long time open source companies, is because maybe they broke their promise to the market, or they broke their promise to the community, and maybe aren't being fully transparent about it, to say, oh, well, it is, it's just a little bit, we changed this, but it's the same. It's not, right? People can see through that. One thing I love about being in the open source community is that people are really authentic and should be really clear on what your intentions are. So I give the example, which is not my example to give, but look at GitLab. They are very clear on this is what's open source and this is what's open core, and they're unapologetic about it, as they should be. They're very clear. The challenge is if you don't have that clarity from the beginning, or you change your mind, you've changed that social contract you've had, or a literal contract you have, then call it for what it is. And if it's for wealth creation for your shareholders, then understand it's still open source, and some community members might take it and fork it as they can under the original license if it was set up that way, and that's the outcome that you're going to have, right? We're in a free market.
What kind of major trends you're saying when it comes to, like, there are a lot of companies, a lot of course there are foundations now where they continue to maintain the project the way it is, they maintain a church versus state
Church and state.
philosophy, yeah. But then there are a lot of things overlaps happening where you feel that these are minor issues, or you look at some of the past years development and you're like, you know what, this is really becoming a major issue, we should deal with it. That's why you mentioned, we may have to come up with the new license. So what are those? You mentioned investors are one reason, is cloud, because it's very easy to blame on the cloud. But if you look at the early days of open source, the licenses, whether it's FSF or OSI, the whole idea was when you redistribute the code, if I am not distributing anything back, if everything is running on my cloud, I'm not bound by that license. So do you feel that we need new licenses? Do we need new business models? So I just want to hear from you. What are some of the
Right.
major disturbing trends you're seeing, and what you think may be the right approach?
For me, it boils down to where we say breaking that code, it's coming to trust. Large enterprises are using open source every single day, and they have been for a very long time. You cannot be running production anything. I'm in the database space, right? If you have concerns that it's not going to be maintained any longer, or there's going to be a change in license, or it goes away. So one area that we've seen some success is in foundations that don't have one single enterprise that owns them. So, right, you look at Kubernetes, you look at what Linux Foundation has done, you look at Postgres. Those are great examples that any organization, I'm sure, has challenges, and how do we make sure that they remain up with the times and modern and listen to different voices and not just the core group. That's going to be a challenge for any organization. But thinking about that more and saying how do you go into a foundation so you have a lot of folks contributing, so that the viability of that project remains. And is it time for another license? Another challenge that I see, and it wouldn't be complete conversation if we don't say AI. So, okay, now we've said AI, but whose work is that, right? So that's the question of whose work is it, and even just having definitions and working more closely with governments and not just industry, not just investors. How do you do that? A couple weeks ago, I was at the State of Open Con, put on by Open UK, and they brought in folks from government and having those conversations. How do we define open source? How do we define what that means? And you want to be self-regulated, right? I'm sure people would prefer to keep out governments regardless of what country they're working in. But how do we have those conversations and help define things as we are in another area of rapid development, particularly with machine learning and AI right now? So I don't have a succinct answer for you because it's quite large and how to break it out, right? It's multi-pronged. It has to be multi-pronged.
You threw the AI wrench there. I mean, we were still trying to see where cloud fits in open source. Most of the time when companies do kind of say that, "Hey, we are changing a license because those cloud providers are taking the code," and it's becoming, so cloud was a big thing. And now we are talking about AI. I talked to OSI folks as well, that do we need, and they're like, I mean, we are, this is going on, but cloud has been around for a while and nothing changed in terms of licenses. Companies came out with their own licenses. That takes us back to the early days where licenses were not compatible with each other, and that's why OSI and they came up to make sure that you can work between different licenses. So when we look at cloud and of course Gen AI, what are the, so there may be some long-term challenges that may evolve over time. What are the immediate ones that you see even for a company like Percona, where you're like, hey, this may become a pain for us, so we need to address it? Or you feel like, yes, over a period of time new challenges will arise and we will deal with them when we cross that bridge?
My approach is yes, cloud is an amazing competitor. We can put names to it. So as a CEO, you're a CEO as well. What does that mean? I need to put out a more valuable product. I need to be giving customers as much value or more value and solving the problems. And we're all playing from the same landscape. Different funding mechanisms are a choice, and I'm not going to ever be upset from somebody's success because I'm striving hard to be successful as well, right? So I look at competition as raising the bar, and ultimately it's for the good of the customer and solving their problems. So um, cloud is challenging. What have they done right? What have they done well? What are they seeing and problems they're solving? And how do I continue to do that as well? So um, that's the immediate, as opposed to, uh, there's an American phrase, I'm just going to take my ball and go home. I feel a little bit that that's what's happening with some folks as they're putting out licenses of, hey, I'm only going to put it as source available because I don't want somebody else making money on it. Only I can make money on it. Well, have you proven you can make money on it? Right? Are you solving that problem, or are you really wanting to help with innovation and seeing for others? So I don't believe it's a zero sum game. There's opportunities, and it's solving problems for the customers, and the market shows you'll be rewarded for that.
Because of these changing times, either it's cloud or Gen AI, other factors, how are companies like Percona, which can be seen as either a proponent or patrons, of open source, because as we discussed earlier, commercialization is really important for the sustenance of open source. How is your role changing in the ecosystem where you feel that you have to evolve? And I'm talking about as a company with the changing times. So not only, as you said, to stay ahead of, not ahead, but to remain a viable competitor also, it doesn't matter who it is, but at the same time remain a patron to the open source community, so they do know that they have backing of somebody when they are putting their time and effort into maintaining that code base. So these are two wrong questions here.
What we develop and we put out and continue with our brand promise, right? Of we know that all of our users won't always be paying customers. And of course, we always want to be getting value, but we're dedicated in putting that out there and helping them be successful with their databases. So we continue to look at that and make sure again that we're providing value on making sure that you're a viable business while doing that. Um, I think of it in a couple ways. There's users and contributors. How are people contributing back? And also being realistic that you mentioned it earlier. It's not free. Somebody is putting their time in to it. Um, just being mindful of that. So I will say that and I don't believe it's lip service. You're watching a lot of large enterprises and Amazon and Google that they are giving back to open source, and they are putting in resources, they're putting in time, they're putting in sponsorships. And yes, they've also built upon open source as they can, right? So how do you make sure that you're giving back and you're supporting those projects? And it's something for all of us. It's maintainers, and making sure that maintainers are properly compensated is probably another topic for another show, multiple, because that's really going to be the key of it. Why will people want to keep innovating out in the open if there's no gain for them, or it's just hard to maintain, right? Those are areas that being mindful of, and making sure that you're not just a taker, that you're a giver as well. It has to be both.
Earlier, you were talking about that when you're starting a company, this is the model or the promise you're making. And when we look at Percona or when we look at open source, and if I ask you a very flat question, a very bland state, what is the promise that open source is making today?
The promise that open source is making today hasn't changed, in my opinion. It's democratizing software development, in this case, software, could be hardware, understanding that by doing it out in the open and welcoming others to do that together is for the collective good. And it continues to drive innovation that should be doing for improvements for society. Some of those improvements can be quality of life if there's wealth creation, that and there's an opportunity with open source to attract communities that maybe in the past have been closed out, right? Because of the global nature and with the expansion of internet and access and mobile phones, more and more folks are able to participate. Again, that's rising everybody, that has the ability to rise everybody up. And that is not just a promise, that's a reality of what open source can done, but it takes intention and effort to make sure that that's happening.
Do you also feel that this promise can survive the changing market dynamics? Cloud is already there, Gen AI is also coming, or companies should readjust some part of this promise, or they should stick to the promise and try to adjust the either the business side of it or investment side? What I'm asking you is, as leading Percona, what kind of compromises you are willing to make or you think companies should make?
To date, we haven't been willing to compromise on putting our software out. We don't have an open core model. We have continued to monetize on services. That's where we monetize our expertise. Everybody has the right to monetize their expertise, in my opinion. We've done it through services. We understand that. People just need to be really clear on what they're doing and why they're doing it. And I believe that they should look themselves in the mirror and say, are you using open source just as a marketing tool, or do you really believe? If you're using it as a marketing tool, I would ask you to stop. Just stop. Just stop. You all right? Or just people appreciate clarity. Customers just want things to work well for themselves and ease of use and a great customer experience. Some will do it because they don't want vendor lock-in. Some will do it because they believe in open source. Some will just say, it works better. It gives me more options, more opportunities myself. Just, you have to be real. I don't know. I just think you just have to be real and have a real conversation.
What would be your advice, where once again, as you earlier said, that be very clear whether you want to go open source way, think about 5 years ahead, so you don't bait and switch that after 5 years you're like, no, we want to change the license. I just want to hear your perspective on that.
If you're an entrepreneur coming out, you have a project that you think like, whoo, this is going to hit big. And what define big, right? Like, is it users, is it downloads, is it wealth for yourself or your investors? I believe in open source, so I'm going to say go open source. If you want to be going an open core model, if you truly believe in open source and community and that growth, then your community version should be fully functioning. It shouldn't be crippled in any way because you're keeping that behind the paywall. Just continue of that extra value add. Sure, put that as open core, but be really clear that I would say, and you had said earlier, like no judgment when we're talking about like the analogy of farms. I'm not here to judge folks and how they want to go about on monetizing. I'm just saying I believe in open source. I believe there's a way that you can have wealth creation for many and do it in such a way that you are being upfront and ethical and not having to do a bait and switch, because nobody wants to be eroding trust with users or customers, regardless of what your business model is. Like nobody wants to erode trust. So keeping them forefront in that mindset when you start out, which isn't easy, to be intentional with everything you do, but that would be my advice.
And thank you so much for taking time out today and talk about this really important topic. We should not take open source for granted. So we have to continue to work in the right direction. Thanks for all those great insights, great advice there. And I would love to chat with you again. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the conversation. It was great.